Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our expected value interviews from NESSIS, a sports analytics conference held in Boston last week. I'm Paul Carr from True Media Networks. Our first episode, posted earlier in the week, featured conversations with Ron Yurko and Danny Chu, who both had presentations related to NFL player tracking data, so be sure to check that out if you missed it. This episode focuses on soccer, talking with Laurie Shaw and Sam Gregory about their NESSIS presentations. We will start with Laurie Shaw, who's a data science fellow at Harvard University, and he also helped organize the conference. Laurie has a PhD from Cambridge, where he studied the structure and evolution of dark matter halos in in-body simulations. I don't really know what that means, but it has something to do with astrophysics. He also studied at McGill and Yale, working on other subjects including cosmology, and he's worked in the hedge fund world before coming to Harvard to study data science. Laurie's presentation was on classifying and analyzing team strategy in professional soccer matches. As he'll explain, that means using player tracking data to look at different formations, offensively and defensively, when a team is ahead or behind, etc. So here's the first of 2 conversations on this podcast with Harvard data science fellow Laurie Shaw. We're talking with Laurie Shaw, data science fellow at Harvard University. He had a paper here, or a presentation here at NESSIS, entitled Classifying and Analyzing Team Strategy in Professional Soccer Matches. Laurie, let's just start what made you want to go this direction with the paper presentation that you're doing here?
First of all, thanks very much for inviting me onto your podcast. So I guess the reason why we started off looking at formations is that we wanted to use all the tracking data that we had in hand to try to understand, try to find patterns and structures in the game of football. So the beautiful thing about tracking data is that it allows you to follow all the motions of players on the pitch. And so one of the overarching projects that we want to work on is to try to see if we can measure team strategy effectively. So can we measure the set of instructions that a manager gives his team, both as a group, and formations is an example of that, but also as individuals, so the individual player instructions, down to marking a player or how they should, to whom they should pass the ball and what types of passes or what kind of runs should they make off the ball. And tracking data allows you to do all of that. So the paper that I presented today was really the first step in that work, was to consider team formations. And by that I mean the positioning of players relative to one another. And I guess one of the main extensions of this piece of work compared to what's been done previously is to think about the different configurations that teams take up when they're defending to when they're attacking.
So I guess the question from a kind of non-data perspective, what's the advantage of doing this? What do you hope to accomplish by doing it this way instead of, a coach or a scout watching a bunch of games from this team and telling you, here's what they do? What can you do with this that maybe is better, faster, whatever, than it would be from an old school method?
I think one of the advantages of relying on data generally is the ability to kind of crunch through very large numbers of games and look for patterns that it would be more difficult for a human to pick up, analyzing just a small handful of games. So, for example, our methodology allows us to dynamically classify team formation. So, at a given instant of the match, try to say, roughly what kind of formation are they playing in, and therefore also to detect changes in formations. And so, one of the big results from the work that we've done is to be able to go through sort of several hundred games and say, what are the patterns in terms of how teams react to certain situations? Can we identify how a manager might react to going a goal down? What are the repeated changes in formation that he or she may tend to make? And indeed, in the data that we've looked at, we have found teams that do demonstrate certain patterns. So teams that routinely make the same formation change when they're a goal down to superior opposition, or perhaps when they're when they're goal down to inferior opposition, or a goal up against superior opposition.
So it's kind of a big shortcut of sorts. We might expect, the team changes formation or whatever once they get ahead or behind, and this gives you an easy way to identify A, that it's happening, and B, exactly what that change is, right?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
As you try to narrow these things down, everyone knows, soccer fans, your handful of basic formations and how they can be edited and whatever. As you narrowed it down, what did you narrow it down to first? And then kind of what did you land on from a formations number? How many different things are we talking about from an offensive and defensive perspective?
So in terms of the number of different formations, so we wanted a very data-driven approach. And so we relied very much on unsupervised learning techniques. We created many measures of the types of formations that teams were playing in based on observations of real data, and then developed a metric for saying how similar is one formation to another. And then when you look over a sample of several hundred games, you can start to group together similar types of formations, and we look at formations on and off the ball separately, and say what kind of unique formations did the teams actually use in that sample of matches, and what we found is that approximately 20 different types of formations that teams would use. Some of them were predominantly defensive formations, so that the sort of the player configurations when teams were out of possession of the ball, and some of them more offensive formations when teams were attacking.
What sort of things, what's the next step with this? Because this, to me, seems very much like a very useful building block that you can then do all sorts of other things with. Where do you see, kind of, as you call them, the extensions of this project going as you try to figure out what's next?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of extensions, and this really was the first step. I would say there are kind of three main directions we want to take this. The first is to have a more granular view on game state and the way that teams play in different game states. So up until now, we've predominantly looked at how teams play in and out of possession of the ball. But we'd like to look at how do teams play, when in transition, when they're trying to establish possession, when they're trying to progress the ball up the field, and when they're trying to create opportunities. And of course, on the defensive side, how do they play in a high press and a low press? Another element to this is to look at things like what's the relationship between defensive disruption and chance creation. Football is a very territorial game, and so often the best chances are created when the attacking team makes space in the opponent's team box. But to what degree do they need to disrupt the defense in order to do that? And obviously that's very relevant to considering things like the chances created through counterattacking, or through high pressing, or through particularly good pieces of creative play.
I want to take a step back from this specific presentation and ask you about your background, because I think just reading through what you've done, you have work in astrophysics, you've worked for a hedge fund, now you're here at Harvard and you're doing soccer papers, which is a very interesting thing. Tell me about your academic path and how that kind of all brought you to where you are now.
Yes, it's been an unusual career. So I started out in academia and working in astrophysics. So my PhD was looking at how galaxies form in the universe. I guess the reason I left academia was that I found I wanted to work in a sort of more fast-paced environment, one in which you're actually applying the research that you do. I went to work in finance for a couple of years, which certainly was quite a fast-paced environment, and in some ways, almost one of the most educational experiences in terms of learning how to work with lots of different types of data and lots of different statistical techniques. The place where I worked hired people from physics, but also from statistics, from mathematics, from machine learning, so all sorts of different fields. I went to work for the British government in the Treasury Department, and that was, one reason for that was that it was a very interesting application. I think working in finance was very technically challenging, but ultimately just wasn't very interested in the area of investment. Whereas working for the British government, you felt like you were making decisions that were important and relevant to people's lives, and so I very much enjoyed doing that. And at Harvard, in some ways, my position here kind of brings together a lot of these things because really, as a data science fellow, I feel that if nothing, my career has been one in data science, sort of working in different areas, developing different skills, and trying to bring the techniques that we use in one area and apply them to another. And in sports analytics is almost a perfect example of a cross-disciplinary endeavor. One in which there are people who are from the hard sciences, from physics, from computer science and statistics, but also people who are interested in working in this area from the business school here, particularly sort of the finances of football and or other sports and issues like competitive balance. But then the School of Public Health as well, questions such as injuries and fatigue and other areas such as that.
One of the other panelists I was talking to said something about how sports analytics, generally speaking, has become much more accepted or absorbed maybe by the general analytics community over the last 5 years, 10 years or so. What do you think about that? And if you agree with it, what are some of the reasons you think maybe the perception of sports analytics has changed from a kind of an greater academic perspective in recent years?
I think it's completely right. I mean, it really is, it feels like in the last 5 to 10 years, it's really become much more of an academic endeavor. A lot of the advances have done great work by people who, were working in the amateur blogging community. As it's become more data rich, I think that, that has really kind of caught the attention of many academics who are sort of looking to work in an area where, that has been relatively unmined. And the advent of, event data and now tracking data means that, there's a lot of scope for looking for interesting signals and trying to understand the sport from a different perspective, which is really what sports analytics is all about.
One last question: the astrophysics background, how does that, or does it help you as you're looking at soccer? Like mindset, are there literal applications from things you learn there? I'm just curious, like how the two connect and help you out as you're looking at more of the sports stuff.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I find astrophysicists in lots of different areas of work. There are astrophysicists working in the British government, plenty in finance, and I think one of the reasons for that is physics is both a very theoretical subject, one in which you're encouraged to learn the sort of fundamental principles, the fundamental laws of nature, and build models that describe how systems work, but one that's also extremely data rich. And that's particularly true of astrophysics and astronomy, where there are sort of both ground and space-based projects that are surveying the sky, almost continuously, collecting vast amounts of data. And so physicists need to be well trained in the sort of fundamentals and the theoretical side of things, but also well trained in terms of data analysis and statistics. And I think that's provides a great training basically to go into like many other fields, including sports analytics.
It makes sense when you explain it that way. Laurie Shaw, thanks for joining us here on Expected Value. Thanks to Laurie Shaw for talking with us here on Expected Value. You can follow Laurie on Twitter at 85point, spell it all out. Our next guest is Sam Gregory, a data scientist at Sportlogiq, which is a Montreal-based company that focuses on using artificial intelligence in sports analytics. Sam's presentation was entitled Unsupervised Run Type Detection, and somewhat similar to what Danny Chu talked about in our first NESSIS podcast. Sam used player tracking data to identify off-the-ball runs that players made, with an eye on both pre- and post-match analysis and player recruitment. Sam previously worked at Opta, so he has extensive experience in the soccer analytics world. And after this, Albert Larcada and I will be back to react to the interviews and talk about NESSIS. Now, here's the Expected Value conversation with Sam Gregory. We're joined now by Sam Gregory, Sportlogiq data analyst. His presentation here at NESSIS was called Unsupervised Run Type Detection. This is, as I don't have to tell you, Sam, a soccer presentation. Tell us kind of what does that mean? I know it's talking about off-the-ball runs, so tell us kind of what off-the-ball runs are for the uninitiated in soccer and why this project kind of caught your eye.
What I was trying to look at was what players are doing off the ball when their team's in possession. So from event data, we get every pass that a player makes, where they make it, but we don't understand what's happening off the ball, so either before a player receives it or even if they don't receive the ball at all. So from tracking data, we can see what the position of all 22 players are at 25 times per second. So we get an idea of what they're actually doing, how they're creating space. And I think in soccer, more than most sports, what the movement off the ball is incredibly important. I mean, there's a famous quote that the average player is only on the ball for 3 minutes of a 90-minute match. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but yeah, so what players are doing off the ball is really important, and it's something we haven't really been able to come up with a way to describe or actually measure. So my project was sort of twofold. One is just to be able to measure when players are making runs off the ball, and then also to come up with sort of a vocabulary that we can start using consistent words to talk about what players are doing off the ball, and use building blocks to sort of say these group of activities are similar.
So give me kind of the layman's version of what you did through this process.
Yeah, so the first thing I did was to say you have all these continuous tracks. You'll have a player and where they are let's say for 45 minutes, the entire half, you'll have where they're at every single point. So the first thing I had to do was cut up and say, when is a player actually making an intentional run? So not walking, not jogging, but making an intentional run to move from one place to another. So the first thing I did was cut up that. So I looked at when players are moving at a quick speed and accelerating, and then when they decelerate and end the run. So that was the first step, was to just segment everything up into runs. And then I looked at the trajectories of these runs relative to where the players' teammates were. So not just where it was on the pitch, but where the players' teammates were as well, and grouped together runs that had a similar trajectory. So runs where the arc was similar, the location relative to teammates was similar, and then grouped those together.
So this is an audio medium, obviously, so pictures aren't exactly going to come across, but tell me visually, like, what do you end up with that you can then show someone and say, hey, look what this guy is doing? Visually, what do you have at kind of the end of this process?
So a coach will say, okay, if you show a coach a clip of a game, they'll be able to say, okay, here, this fullback made an overlapping run. But we don't really have any way to track how many overlapping runs that fullback made, what the definition of an overlapping run actually is, and sort of figure out how a player is able to affect the game through their overlapping runs. So what we get from the output of this is a series of runs. We'll have every single time that a player made a run, which falls into a specific group. And then we can give those groups names. So I will look at a group of runs and say, those are all overlapping runs. So now we can say, rather than, oh, Hector Bellerin made a lot of overlapping runs that game, we can say Hector Bellerin made 7 overlapping runs this game. And the same with all sorts of runs, which we don't even really have language to describe yet. So one run that I looked at a lot was midfield runs from central midfielders that just move the play from one side of the pitch to the other. And we don't really have a word for that. I mean, it took me a sentence to describe. So the idea is to sort of take those runs as well that aren't as well defined as overlapping runs and say, these runs are all grouped together. Can we come up with a name that really typifies these runs and use them in our analysis?
You said something earlier about how one advantage of this methodology, this process, is that you can tweak it super easily. Can you kind of just explain that again, and how it just makes this data a little easier to work with in this, at least in this end form?
Yeah, so the data that I was working with is from like a top European league. So the first thing I mentioned that I had like acceleration and speed targets that a player had to meet to make a run. That might be very different if you're looking at college soccer, let's say, or MLS. And so that's the first way you can start to tweak this, is to look at what is the average velocity of a player in this league? What do we consider a sprint in this league versus just jogging? And the second way would be the actual runs themselves. So I chose 70 run types because I thought that looked good. A coach might say, 70 is too many. I want to know 10 different run types. And so you could easily use this exact same framework, narrow down the number of runs to 10. So I think what I've done essentially is built a framework for identifying and classifying runs, but it's not necessarily this is the Sam Gregory way of how to classify runs and it's the way that everyone should be using. It's more, this is a setup of how I've thought about the problem, and I think can be extended to the way a lot of other people would think about the problem.
So you've talked about some ways that you could use this data. What are some of kind of the macro applications? So a coach, technical director, whatever, comes to you and says, hey, this is cool. How would you suggest I use this? What would you say to him?
I think I said in the talk that I think the number one takeaway is it's just a way to easily query tracking data. So right now with tracking data, it's really hard for coaches to use because it's massive. They don't know what to look for. They don't know how to tell an analyst. Even if an analyst knows how to use it, they don't really know how to tell an analyst to get what they want out of it. Whereas this is quite a visual representation, and it gives you an actual event that you can look for, which is the run itself. So a coach might look at a map of 5 different run types and say, that's the run that I want this player to be making, or that's the run that I want a potential player that we're looking to sign to be making. And they could say, okay, show me the player who makes the most of these runs in this league that we're scouting in. So I think it's just a way of, and then they could pull up the video from that as well. So it's a way of taking this really complex data set, which coaches know they want to use to measure off the ball performance or movement off the ball, and allow coaches to actually have the power to use that, or not just coaches, but people in less technical backgrounds to be able to point to what they want and get that from it.
One thing I found interesting about the conference is that everyone's very aware that most of these presentations are almost building blocks toward something else, even if we don't know what that something else is. So what, as the buzzword extension, what are the extensions or some possible extensions that you would see from what you've done so far?
I think what I've done here is actually in a lot of ways simpler than what some of the more complex tracking projects have done. So if you look at some of the really advanced work that's been done with soccer tracking data, expected possession value is a great example. So this is a model which gives a value to every single point of a game. So every single frame of tracking data, you can say, what is the probability a goal is going to be scored here? And the problem with that is it's incredibly difficult to distill that down to a coach. You have to inherently trust the model. It's hard to figure out. The value changes every single frame. So it's really hard to kind of take this work, which is really interesting, kind of groundbreaking work, and bring it down to a coach's level, or not bring it down to a coach's level, but make it explainable. And I think that this kind of work of taking tracking data and turning it into something that someone can look at and see patterns that they have seen in the game, and then use those patterns to sort of as an entry point into this more advanced modeling, so into things like pass probabilities, into things like expected possession value. It's sort of, this work is kind of trying to fill the gap between what actually happens in a professional soccer team and the advanced modeling work that's been done with tracking data.
Before you were with Sportlogiq, you were with Opta, so you've got fairly extensive sports analytics background, we'll say. I'm curious, even before that, what was your kind of path, we'll say, through university, college, on up into where you are now? So kind of how did you get here?
I was always interested in sports and statistics. Apparently, when I was a kid, I used to try and look through baseball box scores and find errors in the local paper where they'd made an error in the baseball box score. So I was always interested in kind of sports and stats. I think it was mostly because I was interested in sports and good at math growing up. And so it wasn't until I read Moneyball, like everyone else, and got into university, I sort of thought, oh, I wonder if people are doing this in soccer. Found people doing similar work, or doing really at the time pretty basic work in soccer. And I started on a personal blog. Then I started writing for Sportsnet, which was until this last year the broadcaster of the Premier League in Canada. Then I moved to the UK to do my master's. So I did my undergrad in economics and did a master's in economics as well in London. And when I was there, I started doing some consulting for clubs. And from there, I got the job at Opta, and now I'm at Sportlogiq.
Always interesting to me to just see how people get to these jobs that, probably didn't exist, say, when you were in college, something like that. All right, Sam Gregory, data analyst at Sportlogiq. Thanks for joining us here on Expected Value. Thanks to Sportlogiq data analyst Sam Gregory for joining us on Expected Value. You can follow Sam on Twitter at GregoryDSam. I'm now joined in the True Media Network studios by Albert Larcata, True Media's Senior Director of Business Development and Data Science. Albert was also at NESSIS last weekend. Albert, what did you take away on the soccer front from the conference?
Sort of my high-level takeaway relates more to the general tracking data environment in soccer being a little bit different than it is in the American sports. Most leagues everywhere in the world, including Europe, don't actually have tracking data yet. Even the ones that do, there's no sharing agreement between clubs in the different leagues. So if you're a team in Bundesliga, very likely the only tracking data you're getting is on other Bundesliga players. So that limits the usefulness in the recruiting area, just because you won't have tracking data metrics on a lot of the targets that you're going after in the transfer window, which is not something, obviously, that Major League Baseball, NBA, NFL, etc. teams have to deal with because their talent pool is generally all within that one league. So anyway, because of that, I feel like the tracking data research, both publicly and privately, is going to have a lot more use cases in opposition scouting, self-scouting. So the research that Laurie and Sam did focused a lot on those use cases, which, again, I think is going to have a lot more value to teams than some kind of player valuation type of metric that's more useful in the recruiting space.
Yeah, that WAR metric is definitely kind of the holy grail or the sexy thing that you want to see kind of come out of analytics. But you're right. What they talked about was less about player evaluation, much more about scouting and tactics. And I think that kind of runs right into what I was struck by, the similarities between Sam's presentation, the second soccer conversation, and Danny Chu's conversation that we had in his presentation about football. They both kind of did the same thing, identifying routes or runs in different sports using the player tracking data. And it continued, I thought, just kind of an overall theme of this conference and other conferences of this ilk sometimes. Lots of these presentations are building blocks that will get built upon by some of these same researchers, whether it's teams, leagues, whoever it might be. But this is the first step in a lot of ways. And it may just take a lot more time, money, effort, technology to make those next steps and make what they're doing super valuable. But these are really good starting points. And there's also value in these building blocks. It's not just a building block, but there's some use here. And we'll keep adding on to that as a general analytics community and making everything more and more useful as we figure this tracking data out more and more.
Yeah, totally agree. Definitely relates to the tracking data being newish in the public space, especially. If we're talking about frameworks based off of event level data in some of these sports, we're a little bit past that now, but certainly in the tracking space, building out frameworks is right where we are.
Yeah, it's certainly exciting to see where we're going to go in these sports that have tracking data just coming to the forefront in the last year or two. That'll wrap up our pair of NESSIS podcasts. Thanks again to all four of our guests for taking time to chat with us at the conference, and I hope you enjoyed listening to something a little bit different. A reminder to subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get the podcast and keep spreading the word to help us keep growing. On behalf of Albert Arcata and everyone at True Media Networks, I'm Paul Carr. Thank you for listening to Expected Value, a podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world.